Hi there, and welcome to the My Modern Met Top Artist Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Pierce. Today, I'll be chatting with Dorte Mandrup. She's a Danish architect who has made a huge impact on me and on many other designers. I was excited to sit down with Dorte to learn about her background, her sculptural design style, and the stories behind the firm's recent projects. Throughout her career, Dorte has won many awards for her designs. She's worked on social housing projects and kindergartens that masterfully use cheap materials to create playful but elegant solutions. But her most recent work has taken her to some incredible sites, or as Dorte would say, irreplaceable places. Her studio has recently designed a whale museum with dramatic sweeping curves that frame views out to the sea and the Arctic Circle. Her work can be found right on the border of UNESCO World Heritage sites, like in her Wadden Sea Center. And most recently, you can find her work in Western Greenland in the coastal town of Ilulissat. These projects are special because they have beautiful relationships with their site. They don't compete with the natural beauty of each place, but they focus on enhancing the often sacred experience of engaging with such amazing parts of the world. Dorte opens up about this approach to landscape and architecture. If you've been tuning into Season 2 over the last few weeks, you might already know that our conversations have revolved around artists and designers making an impact. Aside from the impact of Dorte's architecture of irreplaceable places, she's made another impact on the practice of architecture. Dorte responded to a 2017 Design article with the statement, "I am not a female architect. I am an architect." We talk about the hopes she has for future women practicing in architecture and the context of that quote. I can't wait to dive into all of this and much more on the latest episode of the My Modern Met Top Artist Podcast, but that's enough for me. It's time to hear from Dorte herself. Let's start off with understanding the phrase irreplaceable places.
Yeah, well, it could certainly be a little bit misunderstood as implying that we only work in extraordinary places or beautiful places.
Right.
In reality, it should be understood as a way to emphasize the importance of the context and to emphasize the importance of place. And for us, that is part of our working method to try to understand and to use the entire situation around a project, a contextual situation, to, in a way, develop the project.
That's clear in a lot of your projects that seem to really integrate landscape and architecture. Is that something that your firm is really conscious of, the line between the two?
Well, some of our projects, if you take the Wadden Sea Center, for example, it's about the abstract flatness of the landscape and the very wide open horizon. It's also about the traditions, the craftsmanship that is actually used in the region. It's not about it's not a regional architecture, but it's about trying to understand the situation in both formal ways, but also in economic ways and in sort of direct physical ways. I mean, if we look at the Exile Museum that we just competition that we just won in Berlin, the whole context is all about the history of the place, which is pretty devastating, you could say. It's about the Nazi history, and it's about trying to relate to that and to the exhalation of people around or after 1933. So it's very much depending on each project that we work on. I mean, in the Icefjord Center, I think it's very much about the landscape, but it's also about the time that the landscape has been created in, you could say. It's one of the geographically oldest areas in the world. You could say the bedrock of Greenland is the absolute oldest bedrock on Earth. So it all depends on where we are and what is, in a way, relevant to work with.
Of all Dorte's irreplaceable places, Ilulissat may feel the most irreplaceable. Ilulissat is a coastal town in Western Greenland that is sometimes described as the best place to see climate change in action. This is because visitors to Ilulissat, and specifically to Dorte's Icefjord Center, will watch icebergs break off and float away. Dorte tells us about this unique site and how the team approached the design.
The site is in the buffer zone of the UNESCO protected area, and the Icefjord is protected because it's a very unique phenomenon. You have the glacier coming from the ice cap, which is quite far away from the Icefjord Center, actually. But what happens here is that the glacier will carve the icebergs, and they will kind of slowly move out towards the Disco Bay. But in the Disco Bay, there's a ridge in the bottom of the sea bottom that will actually stop the icebergs from moving further out. So they will kind of pack, and then when they are melting off, they will in a way carve again and move out into the ocean as icebergs. So this whole phenomenon is protected by UNESCO as a unique phenomenon, but it's also the place where you can actually see with your own eyes the effects of climate change, because the ice cap has been withdrawing immensely for the last 20, 30 years. And you can for every year, you can actually see how the ice cap is visibly withdrawing. So in one way, it's an absolutely amazingly beautiful place, but it's also a devastating place because you can really see the effects of the climate change. The Icefjord Center is also dedicated to show and to exhibit the importance of ice, but of course, very much also to exhibit how climate change is happening and what it is doing to the ice cap and to the landscape.
I also love the way that you describe the issue of designing a building for that, because you describe that the center is telling the story of ice, of human history, and evolution. So
Yes.
How exactly do those really nuanced and difficult stories kind of become architecture? How do they come from concepts and become sort of details or moments in a building?
I think the way we looked upon the site of the Icefjord Center was very much in a landscape context in some ways, but also very much about building in this kind of practical of how do you build in this climate. It's most of the year, so you can't transport building materials to Greenland. And also you do not have any building materials in Greenland, so everything has to be transported there. So basically, all of these different parameters, one of the things about the site was that you could actually not see the ice fjord directly from the site, so you had to kind of move out to the edge of the rock or the site to be able to actually see the ice fjord. So to exhibit the ice fjord, we had to make a kind of boomerang shape that would sort of slowly reveal the ice fjord as you move through the building, and it's sort of cantilevered over the edge of the site. And then secondly, by working with this boomerang shape, we actually managed not to get snow buildup around the building because the prevailing winds are from the west. And by shaping the building so it's almost aerodynamic, we could keep the facade free of snow. And we could also keep the entrances and most of the building free of snow buildups, so it doesn't destruct the building. That's some of the things that Danish architects has been doing when they've been working in Greenland in the beginning in the 60s. They would kind of, in a way, bring the knowledge that you have from a normal Danish experience, that you want to have a wind-protected entrance, which actually meant that there were a 2-story high snow buildup behind the house, so you couldn't actually enter the building. So this kind of knowledge is of course important to understand, and I think that all the technical issues are just as important as the emotional issues, if you could say so. So we try to kind of collect all this knowledge before we actually start to conceptualize an idea. So part of the way we've shaped the building is very much about emotions, you could say, and other parts are extremely technical and sort of very practical, trying to solve different problems. The building is sort of floating above the terrain, and for two reasons. One is that we wanted to pay respect to the million of years that the bedrock has been on Earth, and the kind of humility that you feel as an architect, that we only here for a few minutes in that context, and so the building is very lightweight, almost expressing itself as a skeleton of an animal. So it's kind of floating above the ground, and by doing that, we can also ensure that the melt water from the snow from the winter will actually flush underneath the building and drain into the lake in front. So partly practical and partly emotional.
I really love this project. In one graceful move, it meets a technical requirement of combating that harsh Arctic environment, and it creates an incredibly emotional experience. The architectural resolution to both the artistic and the practical are one and the same. This makes a lot of sense when you learn that Dorte didn't always want to be an architect.
Quite young, I wanted to be a sculptress, but many different things happened, and actually I studied medicine for some time, and I ended up in architecture school, which was suiting me really well, and so I stayed on.
Do you think that those combinations of artistic and technical education sort of influenced the way that you approach architecture now?
Yes, I certainly think that there's at least my interests are both, I guess, scientific, but also I spend a lot of time trying to understand art and listening to music and reading books and whatever. So the whole kind of range of the arts, you could say, is extremely important to me. But also I have a sort of a scientific side, or a side of me is really interested in how the world functions, physically. We're standing on two legs, you could say, that I think it's really important that you have knowledge, and that the kind of basis or the scientific basis of what you do is well studied.
How do you balance learning the science and kind of becoming a temporary expert in these ideas with your current expertise of architecture? Do you work with people who are sort of specialists in these ideas and learn as you go for each project?
We try to work in teams. We would have experts on Greenland in the team during the competition as consultants. When we were working in Norway during the whale, we had biologists as experts on whales in our team. Then, of course, there's everything else like sustainability and all of these different knowledges that actually requires expertise and very specialized people. We would find the best, or try to find the best and work with them. And I think that's one of the most wonderful things about being an architect, is that you actually get to work with people that are extremely knowledgeable, and by doing that you always learn new things and in a way get to understand little bits and pieces of what surrounds you. And I think that's an amazing thing about being an architect.
There's a lot of projects in your portfolio that sort of show how complicated creating sustainable projects in difficult climates can be. I wonder if you can share with us or tell us a story about a time that you created something that you thought is really impacting the site. So can you tell us about a time that you created a building that you felt was sustainable and was really making an impact on where it was, that this was a piece of architecture that kind of represented what needs to happen or how architects need to respond to sustainability?
Well, since we just opened the Icefjord Center, it's the first building that comes to mind.
Right.
But because the Icefjord Center is in many ways, of course, the content of the building is the exhibition about ice. But also, I think what we really tried to do here was to also make a building that related to the context, also to the social context, you could say. So by creating a building that is where half the square meters almost are open shelter, so anybody can, on their way out in the UNESCO Park area, can use the building as a shelter. Since you are really in this extremely beautiful but also really harsh climate, the creating of shelter here is in a way of building or creating a human scale in this vast landscape. And I think by also insisting on using the roof as part of the path, we have created a kind of new public plaza, you could almost say, or it's a public space which is also usable for the local community. And I think in a way it feels very natural, and it feels very naturally part of that landscape and also part of the community. So I think the Icefjord Center has in many ways many different kind of aspects to it, and then of course creating a building where we were taking care of how much CO2, of course, or the footprint that we created here in this landscape. And I really think that we've been extremely thorough in trying to reduce the amount of transportation and to reduce the amount of maintenance. And so I think there's, and in the use of materiality and so forth, everything is very worked through. And I think even if you come down to the details, one funny story, because actually we haven't been there after the opening because of COVID. But the director of the exhibition center or of the Icefjord Center says that she can always see when there's a local craftsman coming in, and they've been part of the team that is building the house. So they kind of they come in and they kind of straighten up their back, and she can immediately see that, okay, so you were part of the building team. And so in that sense, it's definitely in a way landed in the community. There's pride around the building, and it's been built by local contractors. So there's I think everything kind of came out really well for the Icefjord Center, and I'm quite proud of that.
Gift giving is an art, and thanks to the internet, it's easier than ever to find that perfect present for someone. With so much to choose from, how do you find that special something without hours of searching? Well, that's where My Modern Med Store comes in. Since 2017, we've been curating the best creative products for makers around the world. Whether you're looking for a gift for an artist, architect, space lover, or anywhere in between, we have you covered. One of my all-time favorite things in My Modern Met Store is a planter that defies gravity. Yes, really. It's the stylish Life Levitating Planter, and it's perfect for all you minimalists out there. It has an angular white pop that hovers over a rich oak base, all thanks to magnets. But if you're lacking a green thumb, there's plenty more in our store to check out. As a listener of Top Artist, you can get 10% off your entire purchase when you use the code TOPARTIST10 at checkout. Again, that's TOPARTIST10 for 10% off everything in My Modern Med Store. Happy shopping!
I was so excited to talk to Dorte this season because she made me rethink the way I talk about women in architecture. Specifically, Dorte made an impact on the field of architecture when she made a somewhat controversial response to a 2017 Dezeen article that highlighted contemporary women in the field.
One article that I have not written, because you've made me think a lot about it, is here are some great women in architecture. And the reason why I haven't written that article is because you sort of spoke out and said a phrase to Dezeen, "I am not a female architect, I am an architect."
Yes.
Can you tell us about the context of that quote?
I guess I in a way I had to react. Somehow it might have been misunderstood as an anti-feminist quote, but it was certainly not. It was
Right.
because through my career I've been, when you receive a prize or when people kind of say congratulations, I love your architect, it's so feminine. It's not that I'm not provoked by the term that my architecture should be feminine, but I was really provoked that there were certain lists and certain books and certain little boxes where you could put women in a way that was very patronizing, because it was very much about how amazing it is that you actually doing architecture and you're a woman. And I think that was kind of the starting point for me to write this article. And I know that a lot of women architects has been working for many years to create better premises for women to make architecture, and I really admire that. And I wasn't actually trying to not to recognize that enormous work, but to me, I think we need to be more radical now, because it's still like 50% of the architecture school are women, and when you follow them 10 years after, they are not in the leading positions. They're not creating their own offices. So there's a lot of bias still in the business. And I think we need to be much more radical to insist that we are really part of the architecture realm, and we are competing on the same terms, of course, but that we need to have equal terms to compete on also.
And while you were sort of responding to the varied opinions on that subject, you mentioned that when you first got your start in architecture, that you worked on a lot of projects for children or schools and those sort of projects, and they were seen as, well, here is a commission that a woman can respond to.
Exactly. Yeah.
And while you appreciated those projects, it felt, you weren't being respected as an architect.
Yes.
Do you feel that has changed? Do you feel that the projects that you're working on now, you're viewed as an architect instead of being seen as just a female architect?
Yes, I guess experience helps a lot, and also getting older helps, and of course, building up your portfolio helps. But it's quite obvious if you see some of the great female architects like Grafton or I can mention many other really, really great architects that are also female, and that it seems like it takes much longer time for women to, in a way, establish themselves as not as female architects, but as architects. And I wonder why that is, but I think it is because it is actually still quite difficult to get or to be to have authority in the building business because it's still a sort of a boys' club. The clients are, most of them are men, and there will be this kind of understanding between men, that is so much easier than being a woman and having to kind of push your way into that.
So aside from highlighting women in architecture in this way that separates them from the fields that men are practicing in, does your office engage in supporting women in architecture in other ways, or what advice do you have for how to do that more productively?
Well, one of the things that we are engaging very much in is trying to walk the talk. What we do is we actually actively look at the people that we have employed, or my colleagues. We actually, and I don't think it's difficult because there are so many really great women architects, but we do actively look into the balance of the management and the balance of the leading architects or the senior architects and the so we have a 50-50 balance all the way through. And what we try to do is also recommend officers or architects that I know of that happen to be women. So I think really that you need to walk the talk, and I think you need to be very precise with whatever you do. By insisting on equality in the office, you can also insist on that the people that you work with, I mean the collaborators, the consultants, everybody that you kind of work with, that they have the same ambitions, at least, to have as equal and diverse offices as possible. So in that way, I think you can spread the ambitions, and I think you have to demand that also. I mean, we would never work with somebody that are not even clients that doesn't share democratic beliefs or ideas on diversity and equality.
This season, we are letting you ask the questions through a session we call Ask the Artist. Here are some of the things you wanted to know about Dorte Mandrup.
So our first Ask the Architect is from @Icefjord, and it is, what architects influenced you as you completed your architectural education and started your own practice?
That's a great question because I've had many heroes, you can say. But when I was in architecture education, it was kind of right at the postmodern times, and I really never felt comfortable with postmodernism. So I was kind of trying to find something I could grab or hold on to. So I was very influenced by the Japanese architects of the time. It was Toyo Ito, it was Itsugo Hasegawa, which were kind of the modern architects at that time, but also, of course, the older Japanese architecture, because I was very preoccupied with the notion of a building being extremely temporary or lightweight, and that you have this kind of osmotic relationship between inside and outside. So I think that's quite deep into my backpack of knowledge, you could say, is kind of this way of thinking architecture, extremely lightweight, extremely thin, thin-skinned. Then later on, I think, I've had many other heroes. I think more and more I look very much into the 50s architects. I think there's some amazing, both brutalist architects from the 50s and 60s, and also some of the classicist or modern classics from the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, those are some great names and great responses. Our next submission is from @TallDavidGoofy, and the question is, what is one thing newer architects or designers are lacking?
Well, one thing that really is one of the things that really puzzles me, and when I have the younger colleagues in the office, is the lack of knowledge of skill. And I think it very much has to do with the computer. Maybe it also has to do with the way you're being taught. It seems like the relationship between skill, sort of human proportion, is really not something that, it's not a knowledge that the younger architects has. So we would, in the office, kind of very old-fashioned kind of say, could you please mark out that space, on the floor, or could you show me how? Because it seems like that's one of the main things, I think, the lack of knowledge about skill. It's not really experience. It's not like, okay, I know how big this plaza is. And I think we were, it might be very old-fashioned, but we were kind of told to measure everything. So you know how big Piazza Navona is, or you have references on skill. That is very useful.
That's some great food for thought for any young designers listening to kind of interrogate their understanding of scale. Maybe start carrying a tape measurement around. So our next submission is from CT Wiggins, and they ask, how easy is it to get started in architecture currently?
Well, in some ways, I think it's easier now than it was, because there's so many channels and possibilities that you have to kind of bring out your work and to show your work. But on the other hand, it's also more complicated today than it was. And I think you need much more knowledge. You need to have maybe bigger organizations and the whole kind of complexity of a building process is different. So in that sense, it's more difficult. But in other ways, I think there's possibilities of, in a way, also coming around. You don't have to know important people necessarily. You don't have to kind of move your way through, older architects. So I think that in that sense, there's a freedom there today and a possibility of bringing your work out there that is great. And I think also the younger architects are really good at using social media and so forth, which is very refreshing, I think.
Our next question comes from Jessica. What's the biggest challenge of being the head of such a big team?
Well, there's one issue all the time, is time. It feels like the time is kind of, that's the one belief issue. That's what we talk a lot about in the offices, how to prioritize my time. But I think that one of the great reliefs for me has been that I actually work with a team that are able to supplement me with everything around the design process. So I'm only doing design now. I didn't do that earlier. I was also doing, everything. And now I have extremely competent people around me that are part of the management and that are really taking wonderful care of everything else than just the design process. So
that sounds like a great place to be in your career, that you can finally focus on the design and have a team to support you and all other functions.
Yeah, that is a privilege, I have to say. It's wonderful.
Our last question is also from Jessica. What do you think the architect's responsibility to the environment is?
Well, I do think that architects has to take the lead in trying to make our business as sustainable as possible. Since when you read statistics, almost 40% of building is actually taking almost 40% of the CO2 footprint that we leave right now. So we really need to be seriously involved in changing that business. It doesn't seem to happen fast enough, and of course we need to have to bring our clients into to be conscious about that they are actually also responsible. So what we try to do is, of course, to convince the clients as much as possible to work in a more sustainable way. But I do think that we have a big responsibility to do that and to actually spread the knowledge that we have, because we do need a lot of knowledge to be able to actually act sustainably. But we also, architects are the profession that are actually able to collect all this knowledge into something that is practically possible.
That was another session of Ask the Artist. If you're just joining the show, this is a series we have been doing all throughout season 2 on the Top Artist podcast. To hear your own questions on the show, be sure to keep up with us on social media, where we'll be releasing sneak peeks at new guests. You can even hear your own voice on the show if you submit your Ask the Artist question as a voice memo through our website.
And then our last question that we ask all of our guests, and it's the focus of this season, is what impact do you hope your work will have?
I do hope, since I'm also teaching a little bit, I do hope that there's a method, or there's an approach in what we do, which is so much about trying to expose the contextual possibilities or contextual potential. And I do hope that we will have the possibility, at least in a small way, to influence the way of thinking of place and context. And in that sense, to kind of make context important again, but in a different way, and also in a way that has to do with the full context. I mean, with the social, economic, sustainable context. So yeah, that would be wonderful.
So how do our guests keep up with all of that? How do they find you on social media and keep up with all of the great projects that are coming out?
Well, mainly our website, dortemandrup.dk, and also we have an Instagram profile. We're not all that active on Facebook, but mainly Instagram and the website.
So we'll be sure to link all of that in the description so people can keep up with you. And we're so excited to share this full episode. So thanks for taking the time to join us.
I hope you really enjoyed learning about these elegant projects and beautiful parts of the world and all of the other interesting things we talked about this episode. If you aren't already following our social channels, now is a great time to head over, because you'll find images of the Icefjord Center, the Whale Museum, and more projects that we talked about. Our socials are also a great place for you to give us recommendations on who you want to hear next. You can also use our socials to submit your own questions when we release new guests for Ask the Artist. Be sure to listen in next time when my co-host Jessica Stewart will sit down with illustrator Nicholas Smith. This episode will cover activism, art, and so much more. It's sure to be a good one. If you love the stories you hear on the podcast, you can keep up to date on all things interesting in art and culture by supporting My Modern Met and the show through our membership program. Just go to My Modern Met and click the membership button in the upper right-hand corner to see all the cool benefits you can get, including ad-free reading. Thank you so much for listening to this episode and for being a supporter of the show. We cannot wait to share more fun and interesting interviews with our favorite artists and designers. We'll see you then.